Dallas from Kentucky. I've been listening to the podcast for almost 10 years. I was 12 when it started, or when I started, he said. I figured with the 12-year anniversary, I'd ask you a question about the podcast. If you had to pick your top 3 moments from the show, could be meetups, interviews, or just your favorite episodes, what would they be? And I got a few questions like this, so I picked Dallas's to use here. And I just was thinking about this before, and I was like, oh man, my top 3, you're asking me to condense it down to 3 of the show, or just doing the show and my whole, experiences over the last 12 years. It's tough to do. A lot of my favorite moments are not necessarily tied to an episode per se. I know some people like, some of the rants over the years on certain subjects, and everyone talks about the Michael Jackson episode 75, and there was an episode, I want to say it was 156. There was a good, nice rant about TNA. There was a Cage Side Seats article. And this had to do with the whole Daphne situation, just exposing the poor treatment of female talent at the time in TNA. And I remember being really angry about that. That was maybe one of the earlier rants I can remember going on. That was episode 156. But, forgetting individual episodes like that, a lot of my favorite moments weren't really tied to any particular show. My favorite moment was probably getting 10 minutes to sit down live on Fight TV. I was the Fight TV correspondent in Orlando a few years ago for Wrestlemania weekend. They gave me a microphone, they gave me my own cameraman, and they said, off you go. I'm here with Billy Gunn, sitting next to me right now.
You are kidding me. You're going to introduce me a lot better than that, right?
Well, okay.
That was about like watching grass grow. Let's be a little bit more enthusiastic. Let's get into this. This is going to be your best interview of the day. Here we go. Try it again.
I am here with one half of the greatest tag team of all time, Shogun. I am here with Billy Gunn.
Shogun?
It's great. Hey, I love you guys.
And you remember one thing. See this here? The Mountie always gets his man.
Do you have the flask?
Ah,
there it
is. You can't drink it.
I'll smell it.
Yeah, bitch, boom!
Ooh, that's good stuff. I'm here with Mosh and Thrasher, the Headbangers. Well,
oh my God!
Well, again, you guys are two of my personal favorites. The WWE.
Taste, that's why.
I have great taste, thank you. And the WWE Hall of Fame this weekend, and I'm hoping personally to see you guys in there one day and take your rightful place.
How much is a ticket to get in?
It's quite costly to get into the Hall of Fame.
Save up, and we'll get a ticket, and we'll go to the Hall of Fame.
And they open the doors at WrestleCon, and it's just table after table after table of wrestlers, people walking around. There was no script, there was no outline, there was no plan, there was no list of guests. Whoever was willing to talk to me. Everybody that day that I talked to was willing to talk to me. The only person who said no to me that entire day when he saw me coming over with my cameraman was the Honky Tonk Man, because he knew that I wasn't paying him for the interview. So he basically blew me off and told me to get lost. He didn't say that in those exact words, but he told us to get lost. Everybody else talked to us, and it was a great experience. But the biggest thing for me that day was getting 10 minutes out in the lobby with Mean Gene Okerlund. They gave us stools, we had the backdrop behind us, and I got to do a sit-down interview with Mean Gene Okerlund. And you can find that video. It's up on my YouTube channel with all the interviews that I did at WrestleCon that weekend in 2017, I believe it was. I interviewed a bunch of people that day. Demolition, that was cool. They're my favorite tag team. But to do a sit down with Mean Gene, and then for him to lean over to me when we were done and ask me, hey, what do you do for a living? And I told him, I said, I work in public relations. He goes, I asked because you should be doing this professionally. And I'm thinking to myself, is this real life? Like, what is going on here? Like, how many people can say that Mean Gene paid them that kind of compliment? I mean, come on. So for me, it doesn't get any better than that. That's got to be absolute tops for me. Another one, and this was more of a funny moment, and I have video of this too, which I've put on Facebook before, is getting into the WrestleMania 28 pre-show press conference at Sun Life Stadium. So that was the first WrestleMania I had ever been to live. I have no idea why it took so long. I mean, I've been watching wrestling since 1987, 86, 87. I had seen every WrestleMania. I just never went. Even the ones at Madison Square Garden, never went. So 28 was in Miami. We got together, me and a group of friends, and we went to WrestleMania. And this was The Rock's big return. The Rock was coming back for the first time in 8 years for a singles match against John Cena. And we're in The Rock's hometown in Miami. And I get into this press conference, and they're bringing people out, and Sheamus is there. Mike Tyson popped up behind me. They shot this little angle where he was shouting stuff at Sheamus. I got Mike Tyson. He was so close. He was spitting all over me. And they had Machine Gun Kelly, and they had Chris Jericho, I think. And all these people they brought out. John Cena. I'm asking questions to John Cena. Then they bring out The Rock. And The Rock sits down, and some people are asking questions. Some people you could tell are really nervous. They don't want to maybe raise their hand or whatever. And some of the questions were really not that great. And I'm sitting there going, all right, I have a question for The Rock. I'll put my hand up. And I'm trying to get his attention. And I had no idea that the entire time I was putting my hand up for him to call on me, that Brian Blade, who is a friend of the podcast, as you know, good friend, who was sitting next to me at this press conference. We really had no business being there. I'll just say that right now. I still don't know how we got into this press conference. That's a different story. I won't tell that story. But we're in the press conference, and Brian he's marking out. He's sitting next to me, and I didn't know that the entire time he was pointing at me. He was trying to get The Rock's attention for him to pick on me so I could ask a question. I had no idea he was doing this. So I finally get my chance to ask a question. Nobody else is going to ask him a question. Fine, I'll ask him a question. And I'm starting to ask the question, and it was about the back and forth in the media over the years with Rock and Cena, which felt very real, and you know, The Rock supposedly was not happy about Cena calling him out on some stuff, so that was the question I was asking him about. He stops me, like 2 seconds into asking my question. He stops me. And The Rock goes, "Who's that jabroni sitting next to you?" No, he didn't say that. He stops me and he goes, "Brother, this better be a good question, because your boy's been sitting next to you this entire time going like this." And everyone's laughing, and I'm like, you SOB. I had no idea he was doing that. So that was a cool moment. I asked him my question, and we had a little back and forth with me and The Rock. When you first came back last year, I'm
just going to say really quickly, this better be a good question, because your man right beside you
I'll try. When you first came back, you made reference to the fact that John Cena was talking trash about you for quite a while. Was it any one comment that he made or any one thing he was referring to when you said that really got under your skin?
No, well, it's not necessarily that it got under my skin. It's just for me as a performer, I felt that I needed something that was real to sink my teeth into.
Getting Diamond Dallas Page on the podcast. I've had him on twice, and I had him on, this would have been probably the first time. He was sick as a dog. Sick as a dog. I don't know if he had laryngitis or what. He sounded like he had the plague. He sounded awful. He still came on to do the podcast. He could speak. Obviously, if he couldn't speak, we would have rescheduled. I gave him the choice. He said, "No, brother, let's do it. My doctor told me I shouldn't be talking for more than a few minutes at a time, but let's do it." At the time, I was doing my countdown of the top 15 greatest WCW matches of all time. And one of the matches on my list was Goldberg against DDP for the WCW Championship at Halloween Havoc in 1998. And I thought to myself, man, if I can get DDP on the show, how great would that be? He was in the match. I can get his perspective on the match and what it was like and the planning that went into it. And so he agreed to come on, even though he was sick. We did the interview. And it was fantastic. We went 40 minutes. And it was a great interview. And it was funny because as the interview went on, his voice improved. So if you go back on YouTube, or it's in the archives on Podbean too, and I don't remember the episode number, but listen to the beginning of the interview, and he sounds awful. But as you listen to the interview, as it goes on, his voice improves. And he gets into it more, and he sounds a little bit better, and he's telling Randy Savage stories. It was great. It was just, and he didn't have to do that. That was very cool of him to do. I don't know if any of his DDPY crew are listening to this right now. I know they used to, but if you are, tell him I said hello, and let him know that's one of my favorite moments in the 12 years that I have been doing this show. Yeah, I think of other moments. The live podcast I did with Noah and Brian in Dallas the day after WrestleMania. That was huge for me because it was the first podcast that I got to do live in front of an audience. And we packed the place. It was Monday morning at 11 o'clock in the morning. And the bar, shout out to Frankie's downtown in Dallas. They gave us the entire lower portion of the bar. There was like another bar downstairs, all these tables and a stage. We packed it. We packed the whole place. What else? Oh my God, crashing a Norwegian wedding for one of our listeners in New Orleans. How could I forget? Shout out to Marcus. He and his bride, they were coming to New Orleans for WrestleMania. No family on either side. It was just going to be them alone in this Norwegian church in the middle of Louisiana. I said to Noah, we have to go. We have to go to this wedding. So the degenerates that we are, we get in a cab. We have a couple of hurricanes in our hands because that's what everybody does in New Orleans. They just walk around and it's legal to just walk around and drink. We have our drinks in the cab. I almost walked into the church. I said, maybe you think they'll let me in with this? I'm like, probably not. Let's down this shit and then go into the church. And we became, the witnesses or the designated photographers. We took pictures. It was pretty amazing. I'm wearing a t-shirt, a Sound Off t-shirt with a blazer over my shirt. It was completely ridiculous. But that was a lot of fun. My favorite episode that I've ever done of this podcast is the Mother's Day show that I did 2 years ago, Sound Off 495, where I got my mother on the show, Mama Monster, for the first time, and we did some wrestling trivia, and she killed it. Because I was curious. I said, as I was growing up, you had to put up with all this wrestling crap, and if I was watching wrestling, you'd have to watch, and she picked up a lot of things by osmosis. Shawn Michaels was her favorite wrestler, and she picked up a lot of stuff by osmosis. I was curious, how much did she remember? How much of that knowledge did she retain over the years? And aside from thinking that King Kong Bundy was the one who ran down Stone Cold at Survivor Series, she got most of the questions right. It was actually very impressive. But I remember, when it was over, and obviously, I've lost my mom since then. It was actually less than a year later, I lost her. And I just think, I wanted to really make this an annual, Mother's Day tradition, because Mother's Day is always on a Sunday. And I said to myself, why did it take me so long? Why did it take over 10 years for me to figure this out and have her on the show? Once a year. It could have been like a funny thing and a special thing for her on Mother's Day. I know it would have meant the world to her. I regret that I only got to do one of those. And it really took me so long because people really liked the show. They thought it was very entertaining. I didn't have her on the entire show. I only had her on for about 25 minutes, but people really seemed to enjoy it. So I still kick myself to this day. I wish I would have had her on a long time before that. And maybe we could have made it like an annual tradition. I like to listen back to that show every now and then. I miss her every day. Just, more than you'll ever know. The friends that I've made, through this podcast, including other podcasters and YouTubers, it's incredible. I never would have met Noah. You hear me mention his name a lot. He's become a good friend. He lives in Florida. I'm in New York, so we don't get to see each other all the time, but we talk a lot. I never would have met Noah Mark or Brian Blade were it not for this podcast. Noah was a friend of Webmaster Mike's from the SE Scoops days when I first started the show, and Mike suggested one day, hey, I have a friend who's also a wrestling fan. You're doing this podcast for me. Why don't the two of you come together on Blog Talk Radio once a week after Raw on Monday nights and do a live recap show? We'll call it SE Scoops Live. And that was the first time that I, quote, met Noah. I met him over the phone. We were doing SE Scoops Live every week. I have all those shows in my archives too. One day I'll figure out a way to get those out. But it was through that show. And then I think a year later, maybe, or whatever it was, he came to New York. We met up. And through him, I met Brian. And that's how we got our little Four Horsemen group going. And all the annual WrestleMania trips, it all stemmed from that, it all stemmed from this podcast. That does not happen without the sound off.
You got the video going?
You got it going.
What the fuck is this?
Noah. Noah wanted me to give him a reverse knife edge on this show.
Oh! God bless you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Oh my God.
The commentary work that I'm doing now with House of Glory, that doesn't happen without the sound off. Mistakenly getting an email last year from ITV, or was it earlier this year? It might have been earlier this year, but mistakenly getting that email from ITV over in the UK asking me to Skype into their morning show to talk about the death of Burt Reynolds. That does not happen without them getting my email off my Twitter page because they thought I was a different Jason Solomon. Yes, that really happened. And boy, did I study up on the film career of Burt Reynolds on the way home from the office that night. I legitimately thought that they came to me because they wanted me to talk about his appearance at WrestleMania 10. This is how naive I was. I'm thinking in my head, why would they come to me to talk about Burt Reynolds? I'm like, oh, okay, maybe they just want to get a perspective from somebody. Maybe somebody works there. They're a fan of the podcast. They drop my name. Burt Reynolds made one appearance at a wrestling show at Madison Square Garden once upon a time. And so they want me to talk about that. I'm like, all right, it's kind of odd, but all right. It only hit me later on what had happened. That there's another person with my name, and they had gotten the two of us mixed up. That's insane. But that's one of those crazy stories that I don't get to tell without this podcast. So as you can see, I can't just narrow it down to 3 moments, but I could probably give you 33 and still have many more left over. I am very grateful for all of the experiences that I have been afforded because of this little podcast that I started 12 years ago. It's unbelievable.